The idea that magic comes at a cost is a pervasive theme in literature, folklore, mythology, video games, movies, you name it. The concept suggests that wielding magical powers or engaging with supernatural factions or entities invariably involves a cost. It might be a physical sacrifice, a moral compromise, or some other unforeseen circumstance. In folklore and mythology, we often see characters who acquire magical abilities or are granted wishes, which is just another form of magic, only to discover the steep cost of what they've asked for. The classic tale of the monkey's paw is a really chilling and kind of poignant example of this. So in this story, a family is granted 3 wishes by a magical monkey paw, but each wish brings devastating consequences, ultimately, teaching the family that interfering with fate comes at a terrible cost. Literature and film also explore this theme, often depicting magic as requiring some kind of significant sacrifice. Characters might lose something precious or face dire consequences or find themselves bound by some kind of curse. Goethe's Faust is perhaps one of the most iconic examples of this trope. In pursuit of ultimate knowledge and earthly pleasure, our protagonist enters into a pact with the devil. He exchanges his soul for temporary power and gratification, which he, of course, later regrets. But I think this theme resonates deeply with us because it reflects something we innately believe about our lives, whether or not this is true. I think it's something we all kind of tend to believe, which is that nothing of value comes without a cost or without a price. And just for the record, spoiler alert, I don't know if this is true, but I do think it's something that humans tend to believe is true. In the realm of fantasy, this principle is often made literal through magical systems and the consequences that naturally follow through the use of magic. And I think that the reason this concept is so prevalent is that I think it forces us to ask really interesting questions about our relationship with power, desire, and the unknown. So let's talk about magical systems in terms of the power that it gives a narrative. So in fantasy and literature, the fact that magic has a cost or a price serves multiple purposes, right? So number one, it creates balance within the narrative. It prevents characters from becoming overpowered too quickly, and it adds depth to the storytelling. It creates a more immersive world for us to kind of bite into. And when magic has limitations and consequences, it becomes a tool for character development and, of course, plot progression. And in fact, I would argue that it's the limitations of magic that actually makes it so compelling and interesting. Because if anybody could just do anything they wanted at any time, that doesn't seem like that would be any fun. That would just be that would be really boring for us to watch as an audience. It would be chaotic. Although kind of cool in real life, but anyway. So let's talk about, for example, let's consider the magical system in Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series. So here we have these allomancers, and they gain power by ingesting and then burning specific metals. And each metal grants a unique, different magical ability. This system is interesting to me because it creates a direct link between magical power and resource scarcity. And that adds sort of an economic and strategic layer to the use of magic. The characters have to constantly weigh their desire and the benefits of using their powers against the cost of depleting the natural metal resources of the world. A similar thing happens in Patrick Rothfuss's The Kingkiller Chronicle, where the sympathetic magic system takes a physical toll on the practitioners. The more powerful the working, the greater the risk of physical harm to the user. And this creates a really interesting tension between the desire to wield great magical power and the need for self-preservation. P.S. I'm working on a new series right now, and this is actually a theme in my new series where the character has to use her own vitality and life force to create magic. And so the question always is, how much of my life is this actually worth? But we'll get into that another time. Okay, so anyway, I think that this dichotomy creates a situation where characters are forced to make really difficult decisions in critical moments. But in a lot of these stories, the cost of magic often serves as a metaphor for the price we have to pay in real life for the pursuit of our desires. So in my favorite anime of all time, Full Metal Alchemist, the principle of equivalent exchange underpins not just the alchemical system, which is their magical system in this world, but it's the entire philosophical framework for the story. The protagonists, these two adorable brothers, Edward and Al, and Al Elric, they learned this lesson in honestly like the most brutal way possible when they try to resurrect their mother through the use of forbidden alchemy. And that causes Ed to lose an arm and a leg, while Alphonse loses his entire body. This is the catastrophic event that sort of sets the whole rest of the story into motion, and it sends the brothers on this journey to explore the true meaning of equivalent exchange, where you can't make something from nothing. Everything requires a sacrifice, an equal sacrifice, in order to bring about the change or the desired result that you're looking for through the alchemy. Their quest to regain their original bodies becomes this really profound examination of sacrifice, ambition, and the hubris, really, of thinking that we can cheat the natural order of things without any kind of consequence. And that sort of becomes the theme and the moral of the entire series. So the cost in magic often reflects our real-world belief that power and responsibility are innately linked. In Avatar: The Last Airbender, we see this played out through Katara, who is a waterbender, and she discovers she can bend the water that's in people's blood, and this is actually called blood bending, and it gives her the ability to play like puppet master with other people. So it's this ability to control another person's body by manipulating the water within it is sort of the pinnacle of the power of waterbending. Like, it's this really big deal. But for Katara, using that power comes with a really difficult moral choice. If I overtake this person's free will, what does that make me? Am I corrupting the natural order of things? And if I am, is that forgivable? And under what circumstances? Like, it forces her to ask some really critical questions about who she is and who she wants to be. So I think moral dilemmas like these add layers of complexity to characters and the decisions that they ultimately make. And it asks us, the audience, to consider, what would I do if I was in that position? How far would I go to achieve my goals, to get my mother back, to get my body back, And at what point does the price become too high to pay? In the Witcher series, a game which admittedly I've never played, but I've watched my husband play it, so I think that counts. The cost of magic doesn't necessarily manifest in the actual spell casting, but in the very process of becoming a magic user in the first place. Witchers have to undergo this really painful mutation that grants them superhuman powers to fight monsters, but at the same time, those very deformities and powers mark them as outsiders, and then ultimately separates them from the very people that they are created to protect. And so the cost of magic is this disconnection from their community and their loss of human connection from other people. So the concept of magical cost, like I said earlier, also serves to create tension and raise the stakes in a narrative. When we know that each use of magic might bring unforeseen consequences or drain a limited resource, every act of magic becomes a suspenseful moment, and it becomes a question of intent. What is the person going to do? Who are they really? How is that going to affect their growth as a character? How is it going to affect the story? The use of magic becomes these pivotal moments that require us as an audience to get really invested in what's going to happen. Are they going to choose to use their power? Or, is the goal worth the potential cost? In Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series, like we talked about earlier, the tension is economic as well as personal. The Allomancers have to constantly balance their use of powers against a dwindling supply of metals. And I think this adds a strategic element to every conflict and ties the use of magic to broader themes of resource management and social inequality. And I think that one is particularly interesting because in real life, there's this feeling of the ultimate unfairness of these super powerful, rich people who have every resource at their disposal, and they did nothing or at least very little to deserve that. They weren't better people than the rest of us. They didn't make these ultimate sacrifices. It was just a matter of birth or luck. And I think that one of the things that I enjoy, at least in a fantasy magical system, is that the most powerful magical people don't get to wield that power on a whim. It does require some kind of sacrifice or equivalent exchange. And that as someone reading or consuming this content, that feels pretty good. That's why I think that these stories resonate so strongly with us. I think it's because it reflects a fundamental truth, or at least a perceived truth, about our own world. Everything of value has a cost, or at least should have a cost, and that power ultimately comes with responsibility. and that our choices have consequences. So interestingly, the concept of magical cost isn't confined to the world of fiction by any means. In many real-world magical or spiritual traditions, there's often this understanding that energy must be exchanged, that nothing comes for free. In neo-pagan religions, you might have, the rule of three. In Eastern traditions, you might have this rule of karma. And the idea in both is that everything kind of has a balance and it has a natural consequence. We understand that meaningful change requires effort, sacrifice, and sometimes discomfort. We have to give up old habits in order to form new ones. We have to invest time to learn new skills. And sometimes we have to let go of relationships, circumstances, or beliefs that no longer serve us, or at the very least won't get us from point A to point B. And point B is where we're trying to get to. It's the reason that we're using this magic, right? So the parallel between, fictional magical costs and real-world magical costs is particularly relevant when we consider the role of, intention and willpower. In many fantasy stories, the strength of a character's will or the clarity of their intention has a direct influence on their ability to use certain magic or how successful that magic is. And I think that's, similar to what happens in our own lives, because our commitment and clarity of purpose often determine our ability to affect change. And not just our ability to affect change, but the specificity of the change that we ask for. Is that what we're going to get? And that really depends on how clear we are in our purposes. At the heart of magical transformation are words and thoughts. Okay. And this is true in real life. It's not necessarily as true in fantasy worlds, but in real world magic, the core of that, our ability to manifest, is how we think and what we say. These are the building blocks of magical practice. These are the tools that we use to shape and reshape our reality. So in hoodoo, for example, there's this really powerful concept that I love a lot called putting words on someone. And that's essentially, it means basically to exert your will over someone else, to cast a spell on them, to put magic on them. But we say to put words on someone because words are breath and spirit. They are the intention that lives within our soul, and those are made manifest within words. And when we put our words on someone else, we are exerting our will and our spirit on that person. And I think that's really poignant. And I think it's a really good description of how magic works. And I just love the imagery of that. And you see this idea pop up in other places too, not just in hoodoo. In Christianity, there's this beautiful idea that Jesus Christ, who is described of the Word of God made flesh, and so it's this wonderful idea that God spoke the world into existence, first of all, but also that Jesus himself is the manifested word and spirit and will of God made into a person. And I think that's some really serious magic. And I love the idea that a word can become reality. I think that's really powerful, but I also think that that's where some folks who are practicing magic get kind of tripped up. There's this pervasive idea in magical communities that you have to be really careful and obsessive about how you craft your petition or your prayer or your wish or whatever it is, whatever you want to call it. Otherwise, it might come back to bite you, like it does in the monkey paw, for example. Be careful what you wish for is like bandied about in certain magical circles as this kind of like spiritual warning. But I don't think it does anything beneficial except ignite unnecessary fear and anxiety. That's all that I think this warning does. I don't think we need to sit around and try to think of the perfect incantation with the perfect phrasing and the perfect caveats and the perfect desire, because I think all of this presupposes that the universe is actually sitting around waiting to screw you. And in my experience, that's not the case. The universe isn't just trying to screw you. The universe isn't hoping that you'll forget to say one particular word and therefore, it's going to just release all this havoc. Like you always hear, at least I've always heard about people who were afraid to ask for money without all these different caveats because they were afraid that like a beloved relative would die and leave them an inheritance. Like, I guess that could happen, but in my experience, again, the universe doesn't want to take things from you. I think that the universe wants to give you the tools that you need to be successful, but that's actually another video. Anyway, the point though is that you do need to choose your words carefully, but I don't think that's because you need to avoid some kind of cosmic smackdown, but I think it's because, again, your words shape your thoughts. And as Shakespeare famously said, thinking makes it so. your thoughts become your reality. Your thoughts become who you are, how you behave, and how you shape the world around you. So I think, when you're practicing magic, I think it's fine to ask for what you want. I think the harder part is to know what you want in the first place. I think that's kind of what becomes difficult sometimes. And I also think that's where long-term magical workings come in really handy. And I think we see, in fantasy, we see a lot of short-term workings. We see them casting fireball, and we see them, raising the undead. And all of these things are very cool in a narrative. But in real life, short-term magic is harder to control, I think, than long-term magic. So for example, let's talk about angel magic, which is something that I'm very new to. So I'm just now learning about angel magic, but I have been practicing and I'm finding it very interesting. So the ritual that I've been working with is something that works over the course of 11 days. And there's various reasons for that time frame, but the reason that I think is most compelling is because it gives you a chance to really dig into what you're asking for and to really think about what you want. And it allows time for that desire to evolve. I think sometimes we come to magic with a whim when actually we need to be coming into magic with our will. And that 11-day time span allows your whim to evolve into will as you continue to speak it aloud each day. So one of the little tips that I've learned while working with angel magic is that I don't write out my petition beforehand. When I write it down, it feels like it's set in stone. It feels like this is exactly what I want and I'm certain of it and this isn't going to change. It might be different for you, but that's kind of how I've experienced it. Instead, I just speak the intention aloud as it comes to me in the moment. And I don't worry too much about how it changes from day to day, because that natural evolution, in my experience, is my evolution from the whim that I came into the magic with to the will that I ultimately have, the will that actually guides my life and my values and who I want to be. So I let that petition change. Once I started out a ritual asking for a new job, and by the end of the 11 days, I was actually asking for community, because by verbalizing my request each day and by speaking with my mouth and listening with my ears, it kind of made me realize that the job wasn't actually the thing I needed. It was people and a sense of purpose. And I'm not sure I would have realized that if I was just writing it down ahead of time and just reading the same thing. Like I needed to speak the words that were in my heart, but then let that evolve as time went on. And I think that being open and flexible to change, that's ultimately a form of magic in itself, and it's required for magic to be successful. The ability to adapt, to learn, to transform ourselves and our circumstances, like all of these things are part of the cost of magic, because it requires us to give up what's familiar in order to exchange it for this end goal that we want. There's a willingness we have to let go of our perceptions, to admit when our initial ideas were misguided or undeveloped, and to be brave enough to accept the uncertainty of change. So, when we use magic to bring new talents or gifts into our lives, we're essentially asking to build a muscle. But the thing is, muscles don't grow without resistance. And so magic brings that healthy resistance into our lives so that we have the ability to work against the obstacle, build a skill to overcome that obstacle. And that's how we grow. And once you've built it, it's yours forever. And so that's sort of how I look at when I'm asking for something through magic. I also have to anticipate that means something's going to go a little bit wonky. It means that something in the future is going to be maybe difficult or challenging, but it's a requirement that I go through this obstacle and build this muscle so that I can have the thing that I was asking for in the longer term. And all of this means taking action. There's this old saying, I'm sure you've probably heard, that God helps those who help themselves. And whether or not you believe in God is completely irrelevant. I think the idea is spot on when it comes to working with magic. We're part of this world. And if we want to change it, we have to act within it. We can't just sit around waiting for change to happen. We have to be the change we want to see in the world, right? I think it's the same concept. So yeah, magic isn't about sitting on your couch and waving a wand and waiting for things to happen. It's about getting up, getting out there, making things happen. Magic opens doors, but you still have to walk through them. In fact, I would say magic is more like those automatic doors at the grocery store. They open when you approach, but you've got to get off your ass and walk towards the door. Magic will open the door, but you still have to push the cart through. Okay, so we've been talking about change and movement as the price of magic. But I know some of you are thinking about ethics. Isn't there a risk? What if I harm someone without meaning to? And here's my take on this. I don't get paralyzed overthinking about the harm that magic can do. Because the fact of the matter is, any action we take could harm someone else. If I take a job that 100 other people applied for, I might be taking that job away from someone who needed it more than me. There's this idea also in sociology that people's needs are in constant conflict with each other. And so if we are constantly worried about how our needs conflict with the needs of others, we are paralyzed. We can't do anything in our lives. I think the real thing to do here is to work within your own ethical framework. You know your values. You know your boundaries. As long as your magical workings align with who you believe yourself to be and who you want to be, then I think you're going to be on the right track. Yes, be mindful. Yes, consider the implications of your actions. But that's true for everything in your life, not just magic. So I don't think there's any special rules here. So in fantasy, the concept of magical cost serves a powerful metaphor, again, for these trade-offs we've been talking about that happen in real life. It reminds us that meaningful change, whether in a fictional magical realm or in our day-to-day lives, it all requires investment, and it often involves risk and always brings consequences. So anyway, that's how I think the ideas of magic and the cost of magic manifest in fantasy and in the real world. And as always, I'm always thinking through these things as I'm writing, as I'm creating new content. And, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter. So anyways, hope you all have a great day, and I will see you again on the other side.